Good morning, everyone. I hope you arrived as dry as possible. Thank you so much for getting through the rain and through a bit of a gross morning to get here. I'm thrilled that you're here for the screening of The Public. To begin, we'd like to acknowledge that today's event is taking place on the treaty territory of the Mississaugas of New Credit and the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Huron-Wendat. We are grateful to have the opportunity to work in the community. This film is eligible for the Gross People's Choice Award. Vote for your favorite film at tiff.net/vote. We would like to thank Creative Artists Agency and the Capstone Group for providing us with this film. You've arrived at a very special screening of this film. Today's screening is part of the TIFF Speaker Series. In partnership with the University of Toronto's Munk School of Global Affairs, we offer an extended Q&A with the filmmaker and a subject expert following the film to gain a deeper understanding of some of the social and political issues facing the world today. We'd like to welcome Joseph Wong from the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, who will be joined by the filmmaker Emilio Estevez following the film. So we're extremely excited to have The Public here at TIFF. Emilio Estevez was born in New York City. He has appeared in dozens of films as a writer. His features include Wisdom and Men at Work, as well as the festival selections The War at Home, Bobby, and The Way. The Public is his latest feature. And so to introduce the film this morning, please join me in welcoming Emilio Estevez.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Keith. Thank you all for being here this morning. I'd also like to thank the incredible staff here at TIFF. They've just been wonderful, making sure that we all got here safely. And I'd also like to thank Professor Joseph Wong and the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy for including us in the TIFF Speaker Series. Something that you may or may not know, but the Toronto Public Library System is the busiest public library system in the world. And 70% of Torontonians actually have a library card, which is an extraordinary number. But if you visited the public library lately on either side of the border, you may have noticed that it most likely doesn't resemble the institution you remember as a child or a young adult. And what's impossible to ignore is that the intersectionality of some of the most challenging issues of our day, climate change, homelessness, mental illness, opioid addiction, the dismantling of our civil and constitutional rights, racism and class division, all connect and collide under the roof of your local public library. It's why libraries matter. It's why librarians have become de facto social workers, first responders, and the unsung heroes of our day. A modern-day librarian is what democracy in action looks like. Our film is dedicated to them. So I want to share some words with you by American novelist and activist Anne Lamott, who is largely credited with saving and preventing the closure of the John Steinbeck Public Library in Salinas, California, because some politicians believe that one of the ways to balance the county budget was to close a library named after one of the great American novelists. Ms. Lamott writes, "A free public library is a revolutionary notion, and when people don't have free access to books, then communities are like radios without batteries. You cut people off from essential sources of information, mythical, practical, linguistic, political, and you break them. You render them helpless in the face of political oppression. At a time when the world is quite literally on fire, and oppression continues to rain down on the poor and the marginalized, our film is a timely celebration of peaceful, nonviolent civil disobedience. And the only thing we weaponize is literature. So I say, peace be with you. and enjoy the film. Thank you so much for coming this morning.
It is my pleasure to welcome you to this extended conversation today as part of the TIFF Speaker Series, which brings filmmakers together in dialogue with a subject expert around the themes of the film. Here we try to serve the film as a springboard to talk about some of the deeper issues affecting the world today. We'd like to thank the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy for their partnership on this series, and to the scholars for dedicating their time and expertise. And we invite you to join us year-round at the Lightbox for some of our talks, programs, Real Talk, Books on Film, In Conversation With, to continue the conversation year-round. Today, it is our pleasure to welcome Munk School speaker Joseph Wong, who will lead the conversation around the public. Joseph is the Halpert Professor of Innovation and is an expert on the political economy of global inequality. He is the principal investigator at the Munk School's REACH project, which focuses on innovation and poverty reduction in the global south. So to lead the conversation, please join me in welcoming Joseph Wong and the director of the public, Emilio Estevez.
Thank you so much. Oops, we're not on. Hello, thank you so much. I feel so exposed. Thank you. That's a wonderful reception, and thank you all for staying. So,
Emilio, do you want to introduce us to some of the special guests who will be joining us for this conversation?
well, sure. Yes. Some of you may be familiar, but about 30-some years ago, I did a film that took place in a library. I wasn't. I was going to do. Yeah. But I came to TIFF with this film and a whole different club. And I'd like to introduce some of them right now. Jena Malone.
Don't do that.
Christian Slater.
Hey. It's a beautiful theater. Isn't it so beautiful?
Oh my God. Michael K. Williams. And we're still waiting on Alec, but he'll be joining us shortly.
You know, it's Alec.
We've also got Ryan Dowd, who has just written a book called A Librarian's Guide to Homelessness.
Oh, wow. Excellent. Okay.
Well, thank you so much. First of all, Emilio, I'm sure I speak on behalf of everyone here. That was a terrific film, an important film, and congratulations to you and your colleagues.
Thank you.
It's
Thank you so
fantastic. You know, at the core of your film is this notion of doing what's right. Right? And you know, earlier on this year, you were in an interview and you described the moral imperative of what it is that you're discussing in this film. And I think that's very powerful because what you suggest is that there are right things out there. There are things that are just simply right and there are things that are wrong. And yet, in this film, it takes a heroic act, a real heroic act, to do what's simply right.
That's right.
What does that say about our society, that to do what's right requires heroism worthy of an entire film?
Well, I would say that I owe a lot of the credit to my father, Martin Sheen, who he's been arrested 68 times. And all...
More than Caesar.
Right, exactly. 68 times for social justice issues, homelessness, immigration issues, and nuclear proliferation. And thank God we've solved all of those issues, right? So, but so in the 80s and in the early 90s, when my father was getting arrested, it was often on the nightly news. It was on the local news, and sometimes it would be on national television. And I would watch it with my mom, and I would say, man, he looks like a raving lunatic. And they'd carry him off, and he'd be reciting the Tagore poem, or he'd be reciting the Lord's Prayer. And I understood it fundamentally. I understood what he was doing, but I didn't understand it spiritually until many, many years later, when I got woke by reading Chris Hedges' book and several of them, Cornel West, some of the great Noam Chomsky. When you start reading these guys and you start seeing what my dad was all about and why it was important, and it was what Reinhold Niebuhr calls the sublime madness, right? He was the sublime madness sort of in action, and so I was so moved by that later in life that I felt that this film should reflect that. There was a version of the script that ended was a much darker ending. It was we were in it, because it's been 11 years, this whole process. And so I wrote it during the Bush era, and it had a much more diabolical ending. And then, of course, Obama came along, and I think that he inspired a lot of hope in us, and the film, the script then reflected that.
Folks, join in, chime in whenever.
I loved your question, and I think that it's really interesting to talk about heroism, particularly within a society, because society creates heroes, because really that we are all our own hero, sort of experiencing the worst and the best of our own humanity. But really, it's only within the context of a society or a culture or a collective understanding that you sort of push into that to sort of allow someone's actions to speak greater than just their words. And so I think even as we are all sitting on this stage as sort of these simple humans, we are all trying to push into our own heroism of sort of, surrendering what we know and pushing into what is real and what is right. And I think what's really interesting about what this man is able to do with such a simple, topical, authentic story is that he allows all of the ensemble to have their own inner agenda, which is very much what speaks to what society tells you you should be, you should listen, you should learn, this is how you should breathe. But as you push into that agenda, the human, you always encounter your human. And so somewhere between the agenda and your humanity lies the truth. And so even someone like my character, who would be looking like she's doing right, in the sense of, every sense of the word. She's doing the work, she's reading the books, she's trying to live the mottos that her millennial culture has given her. And but even in that, there's fear. And even in that, she doesn't feel comfortable resurrecting truth, because it's not her truth, and it's not her story. It's their story. And I think that there has to be a point you have to sit down and let someone else be their own hero.
I think it's very, absolutely. I think you raise a really interesting point. In my own research, for instance, our research team is doing work around the world. We're looking at situations of poverty, but we're always speaking on behalf of, right? And so, and please, Emilio and others, please, react to this. Homelessness, as with all other indicators of poverty, homelessness is visible. But homeless people are invisible, right? The folks that we work with are statistics. We work with aggregate data sets, but these are individuals that we are talking about here. Yeah. How is it, as someone who is giving voice, as actors, as creative people, as artists, how do we give voice to people who are, for all intents and purposes, invisible?
I mean, that is the responsibility of the artist. I mean, Emilio is certainly an actor, director, writer that I admire. I mean, he uses his skills, his abilities to do these kinds of stories and do the research required to tell these kinds of stories and show that, you know, yeah, these people may be homeless, but they're still human beings, and you know, we're all on this thing together. And you know, we got to start opening our hearts and doing everything we possibly can. I mean, particularly with mental illness. I mean, there's so many things that, like you said. I mean, that hero thing. I mean, this is a man in this story who's put in a particular circumstance and does end up rising to the occasion. And I mean, that's an example for everyone. And I think that's the beauty of getting to be an artist.
I'd like to share my mic with Mr. Dowd here because I think he can.
So I think this movie, it nailed it in terms of homelessness, which I have to admit, I don't know if I told Emilio this, but the first time I watched the movie, it was with a bit of dread because most movies get homelessness wrong. They either err on the side of just stereotypes of, you know, just mental illness and substance abuse and whatever, or they take the opposite side of the noble poor where there's no sense of humanity, no sense of danger, no sense of error, and they kind of pick one of those two extremes. This movie, I think, actually grabbed the humanity and showed it, kind of all the different colors of happy, sad, angry, making good decisions, sometimes making bad decisions, and it captured the totality of humanity and homelessness in a way that we haven't had a movie in decades, I think, that's done that.
So this morning when I was driving my son to school, he's 12 years old, and I was telling him about the film, and I look forward to sharing this film with him. I think it's entirely appropriate for a youngster, a socially conscious youngster like him. And he asked me a very simple question, but I suspect it will be a very complicated answer. He said, or he asked, well, why can't a library be a shelter? And if I were to put the professorial spin on it and be a little more esoteric, why is a public space only public between 9 and 6? And after 6, it's no longer a public space anymore. Please give me an answer that I can share with my son this afternoon, because I got to pick him up from school.
Because lawyers and corporations run the world. That's why. That's a simple answer. Yeah. And insurance companies.
I was only going to answer as my character, Josh Davis. Because it's the law.
Or I mean, and political opportunism, right? I mean, this is, and it goes back to the first question about the morality in this film is clear cut. And indeed, in the interaction that you have, where I think it was with Alec Baldwin, where he says, well, what will you give me in return to provide shelter for these people? And you have no answer, because there is no answer, right? So it is a question of right and wrong, and it ought not to be obscured by partisanship, politics, and political opportunism. And yet, I don't know, it seems that's the world we live in these days.
Indeed, and I don't believe that the film offers a solution. I don't think there's any one piece of legislation or policy that can solve this problem, but I do think it's a collective effort and a collective consciousness. And if we look at the world as it's on fire, as I said earlier, and it is, quite literally and figuratively, and we all have a tendency to feel helpless as we're sitting next to that raging inferno, because all we have is a little bottle of water. And if we pour on, to what effect? But she's got one, and you've got one, and everybody in this audience has a little bottle of water. And I think if we all dump that on our little bottle of water on the blaze, we got a shot at putting that fire out. So it is about a collective consciousness to take action.
Ryan, you've just written a book on how to turn libraries into shelters, right?
Not exactly.
You've written a book.
So the book's about how to help librarians work with problematic behavior, because there is mental illness there is substance abuse there, and what I try to teach is how to not do it, like this guy here. No offense.
So one of the core
I was
themes.
just going to say too. I mean, it's amazing that it did take 11 years to put a project like this together, and it's just, I don't think it's, any kind of coincidence that, the situation we're in right now is a message like this couldn't be more vitally important.
But you also have to understand, as a filmmaker, as somebody who's going out there and essentially begging for money to get your film made, you walk into a room and you say, I'm going to make a movie that takes place in a library, it deals with homelessness and mental illness, and you can just see their eyes glaze over. And it's going to be funny, and it's going to be sexy, and there's going to be nudity, and they're just like, no. No. Bunch of naked men, no. No.
Teach their own. Oh, I wasn't gonna.
I mean, the core vehicle of this film, of course, is homelessness, and this is a global challenge. The Sustainable Development Goals, for instance, SDG 11, is to ensure that all people in the world have access to adequate, safe, and affordable housing. Close to 1 billion people in the world live in slums, and for anyone who's done any work or spent any time in slums, you can appreciate that having 15% of the world's population living under those conditions is something that's just simply unacceptable. But the fact of the matter is that also there are estimates of about 550,000 Americans who will experience homelessness each year. And for the Canadians in this room, and where we often put our hubris hat on, the fact of the matter is it's estimated that there are 230,000 Canadians who will experience homelessness each year. So proportionally speaking, that's higher than in the US. This isn't a poor country's problem. We're rich countries, we're rich societies. This is something that's happening in our backyard.
Yeah, if we can bail out Wall Street, we ought to be able to take care of our people.
But I think there's a point here that's not being addressed, and I think that it's, as you say, people will find themselves homeless and sort of fluctuate in and out of this space, which is sort of a forgotten space of society. And I can actually kind of speak on the matter. I was raised in a way where we lived in our car, we lived in a Chevy Suburban, we lived in hotel rooms. We were never sleeping on concrete, but there was always that sort of very invisible line between what was safe and what was real. And I think that from having experienced that as a young child, and I'm going to be frank, the beauty of that, because there is something very valuable about teaching our children that true comfort and true stability lies within. And I think that within very rich societies, our need for conquest and comfort is quite absurd sometimes. And I think that the scale is not just that the scale is swinging far to the left of the absence, is I think actually the scale is swinging far too much to the right, which is of surplus. And I think that if we all actually allowed that pendulum to have a healthier swing, where we could go without and then with, I think that's a much more interesting and human way to sort of address or understand not the problem of homelessness, but the sort of just that is how humans migrate through their life, is through the seasons, with you have a lot and you have a little. And it's the feast and famine that we really have to be able to build parameters so that people don't fall further beyond that,
Michael, your character talks about his situation as in part liberating, right? As in part this notion of having that kind of freedom.
Yeah, it's a very painful place to be. That freedom is a freeing space, but it's also it's a painful space. There he goes.
Just say anything.
I thought this was at 1 o'clock. I'm so sorry. I apologize.
Not at all, man. I'm so glad.
Well, please
you're here.
continue with what you were saying.
People are late for my class all the time.
Isn't it wild to walk into a room. Hello. Yeah. Toronto.
But Michael, you were about to.
Yeah, I was saying it's a very painful place. You know, I chose to look at the reasons how he got to that freedom. You know, there are reasons that people end up homeless. You know, there's drug addiction, there's mental illness, there's the inability to find employment because of your previous past with the incarceration system. Excuse me. There are a number
Incredible
of reasons.
dilemma of being a single parent raising children with the inability to do that.
That as well, that, you know, not being able to, you know, I saw in San Francisco people zipping up their tents off the sidewalk to go to work. Like, there are just so many reasons why. So when I say, for me, when I say, all right, how do you end homelessness? For me, is to begin to look at how people got there. What were the roads that led? What were the stepping stones that led a person to that point? And let's look at that pattern, because it's a pattern, you know. And this movie has changed me. You know, it was a point where I was becoming desensitized to seeing people, human beings, living on the street, lying on concrete in like not healthy weather conditions, you know. And I would, you know, oh, that person's homeless, you know, okay, and I just keep it moving. This movie, I can't do that anymore, you know. If it's nothing more than just to stop and look someone in the eyes and say, hey, good morning, you know, it's to acknowledge that I see you. You're not invisible to me anymore. This movie has done that for me.
Thank you. Yeah, that's the visibility, invisibility thing we're talking about, is that a statistic can be visible, but the person, unfortunately, is invisible to us.
And 9 out of 10 times, I mean, they're veterans,
Yeah.
you know, people who are dealing with issues like PTSD. Yes. and are in such need of therapy and help, and the fact that we're not treating that is, you know, we should be ashamed.
It's not right.
Right, it's not right.
We want to go to your questions now, so please place your hand up, and I'll repeat the question so everyone can hear it. Yep, is that over here? Yep.
Thank you.
So the question was about the 11 years since the film started to be made to now, and how the political climate has changed, and yeah, your response to it and what effect it may have.
I would say that it is a unhappy accident, right? That the film has sort of found its way to now being so relevant, and much more than it would have been even 11 years ago when the journey began. Yeah, I would encourage our president to get himself a library card. I'm not sure if he's ever actually set foot in one, frankly.
Yeah, let's go right there. The question was, at what point in the 11 years did the script feel ready, and the moment that Michael attacks Goodson?
I would say that as a writer, you never feel that the script is actually ready. I like to believe that films are never actually finished, they're abandoned. I've had obviously a lot of time to think about how I would make this film. And then the actors get involved, and they have their own take on it, and all of a sudden takes on its own life, and it's the sort of thing that it's like a living, breathing thing that is happening kind of before your eyes, and you hope that the cameras are rolling to capture a lot of what you ultimately ended up seeing in the film. There were a lot of happy accidents on this film. One of them was, in fact, the polar bear. When Jeffrey Wright's character says this polar bear is on loan from the Natural History Museum, it actually was. And when I scouted the location, it wasn't there. And I came back, and there's this polar bear. I said, well, how do I shoot around this? And I thought, no, I'm going to embrace it. It's going to be a part of this. And then it also informs Jena's character, and the conversation continues. As far as the Alec Baldwin's character, the son, attacking Stuart, I wanted to make sure that we still understand that people dealing with mental illness, with addiction, have the capability to become very violent. And I wanted to make sure that the homeless individuals in this film were not all cuddly, that there was that element of danger that was always present.
Time for 2 more questions. Let's go down here.
Actually, that's perfect for my question. I don't know whether this is my own bias coming in on what I saw, but I love in your character and Jena's and in Alex just that hesitancy. It seems to be a constant conflict of, I want to do right, is this the right thing, but I have to take care of myself. I have to take care of myself legally, and I have to take care of myself physically. But how can I do the right thing? And I saw that in your character a lot when he seemed to pause and the hesitancy, and I didn't know, was that intentional? And same with Alex's character with his son and still having that job to do, seeing both sides.
The question was about dramatizing moments of hesitancy and how to insert yourself.
Well, I think that goes back to what we talk about, what makes a hero, and how people rise to those heroic proportions in a very ordinary way. And I think that's what happens with Alec. He is following protocol. Stuart is following protocol. And then sometimes following the rules is not always the best thing. It's not always the best policy. Sometimes following the rules actually gets you in more trouble. So what I thought that all the characters in this film are wrestling with which side you're going to take. In fact, Michael's character asked Stuart, "Are you either one of us or are you one of them?" And the lines are drawn about whose side you're going to take, and that's a gray area, right? It's not quite as black and white as we all want it to be. It's a much more gray area.
I was just going to add that I said this yesterday. We were doing the press line that, like any good script, everyone is right. And this is really his gift as a writer. Everyone in the film is right. They have a position they can defend and a job to do. And homelessness, I live in New York, and homelessness is back. And it's back in terms of its visibility, and it might have been never eradicated, but it might have been reduced somewhat in previous 10, 15 years, but now it's really back in New York. And I always think of where I live in the United States like it's musical chairs. There's the music stops. There's a seat at the table for the overwhelming majority of people historically, or at least it seemed that way. The people who did not have a seat at the table to get a job and have a housing and be able to afford to live, they were almost imperceptible. And now that's not the case anymore. Now in New York, there's a lot of people who there's no seat at the table for them. And you wonder, was it always that way? And awareness is the difference. Has there always been a group of people in major cities in the United States who struggle with housing? Mary Brosnahan, who used to run the Coalition for the Homeless, who I worked with a lot for years, that group was saying that a critical number of people in New York are on the bubble of becoming homeless with one missed rent payment. They're like one payment away from being evicted and being homeless. And they've advocated, with statistics to back them up, that it's in everybody's financial interest and it's more efficacious for the government to just give them the money. Give them the money for the rent and keep them in that house, keep them in that lease, so that they don't get turned back into the other system, which becomes much more costly and much more traumatic for them and their families. But in New York, it's very difficult right now because the homeless population is really much more visible again.
I'm told. Sorry.
The amount of money that you spend in terms of emergency services for somebody on the street averages about $68,000 to $70,000 a year. You house that same person, and it goes down to about $15,000. So the numbers are staggering. Housing first.
Please join me in thanking the cast and crew, the public,